Dave, last few weeks here, we've been talking about progressivism and the progressive idea. We've just recorded and we're publishing a tremendous toolbox series on the progressive idea. We have a new video coming out each day. We recommend that our members all go check it out. Well, we also have a new feature that we're going to be unveiling this week, I believe. We're going to have an email summary every Friday. It'll go out to everyone who's subscribing to our material. It'll be a summary of all the new content that was published this week. So when they receive that, they'll see those toolbox videos on the progressive idea. We've also talked about progressivism here in these podcasts. We talked about the sort of the deep philosophic intellectual origins. We talked a little bit historically how progressivism developed and spread in the United States. And today, I want to take this whole progressive framework and I want to use a concrete example of what progressivism means for us today. Here we are in the middle of 2020. We're modern Americans. Some people are thinking, well, you know, whatever those early progressive intellectuals were saying or writing 150 years ago, what does that have to do with us today? And the answer is a whole lot. It has shaped and directed and framed the way we live in so many ways. And I want to zero in on one. I was going to say a simple example, but it turns out not to be so simple. It's an example that sounds simple at first, but progressivism has made it really complicated. And the example is a job. A job. Progressivism has completely transformed how we think about a job. Now, let's be clear. Let's just put on the table the traditional understanding of a job or the understanding of a job within a genuinely free society where citizens are free. They can make their own choices. They are secure. They're protected by law in their own property. In that situation, then a job is nothing but a voluntary mutual agreement.
Sure.
It's two people coming together and maybe I need some help doing something and you're the guy who you have some talents and skills that can help me get done what I need to get done. So I approach you and I say, I'd like to make a trade here. Would you be willing to do a certain amount of work, a certain kind of work, and I can offer you some kind of compensation? And we talk back and forth, and if we come to an agreement, we call that a job. And if we don't come to an agreement, maybe you don't like what I'm offering in terms of compensation, or as I get to know you better, I think, he's not the right guy, he doesn't have the right skills, he's not the right fit. Either way, if I don't agree or you don't agree, then a job doesn't happen. But where there's agreement and both parties are in on it, we call that a job. And if the job is the result of mutual voluntary agreement, then that means at any moment, if either party ends the agreement, if either party decides, I don't like this situation. And it doesn't really even matter what the reason is. Just if either party says, I no longer want to be part of this agreement. I'm backing out, I'm leaving. It could be the employer. The employer could say, I'm just not happy with this arrangement anymore. Sorry, your job has come to an end. The employer should be free to do that. And the employee at any time, if the employee thinks, I don't like this work situation, no matter what the reason is, that person should be free to walk away and leave a job.
You're talking about free to end a job. Mm-hmm. Let's also not forget the requirement or the enticements if you want to keep the job or if you want to keep the employee. Right? The employer, if you find a really good employee, your job isn't merely to just pay them, but it's to provide them a good working environment. It's to provide them a good working experience. It's to provide them the resources they need to do their job effectively. And on the employee side, it's about not just fulfilling the basic requirements of what that agreement is, but if I want that job to be renewed every day, it's about showing my ability to provide value. If I want to get paid more, to provide additional value, so I can say to the employer, look, we came to this agreement, but I've been offering you additional value, and I would like to be compensated for it, or I'm going to go find somebody else who values my my ability to do that.
That's absolutely right. In fact, I've done quite a bit of employee training in my past, and this is one of the central lessons for employees is this idea of showing up to work with a view of doing, not merely doing the bare minimum that you've been asked to do. There is some bare minimum, part of the job agreement, right? The business owner said, I need you to do X, Y, and Z, whatever those tasks are. You got to get those done, but also look around and try to figure out, how can I become more valuable? How can I offer or produce or do things? It might be your coworkers. What do they need? Do they need some help with something? Is there a way I can help them? It might be the business owner. It might be customers. What can I do to become more valuable? And as employees become more valuable, that's the way they get compensated more, at least by a wise employer. And if an employer is foolish and doesn't compensate those really good employees who are creative and valuable, then those employees tend to go elsewhere. Maybe they go start their own business. Maybe they find someone else who will pay them more.
And what happens to that employer? He goes out of business.
That's right. That's absolutely right.
That employer who doesn't know how to keep good employees, he ends up going out of business. And there might be no more fundamental proof of that or example of that than Ben Franklin, right? I mean, he was working for printers in the 1700s, and he realized my bosses don't have a clue on how to create value out of this business, how to grow this business, how to treat their customers well. I mean, right? If I'm an employer and I want to keep my employees working for me, that means I also have to have customers.
That's right.
Because I have to have money coming in. So I want an employer, as an employee, I want an employer who knows how to treat customers right as well. And Ben Franklin saw his employer doing all of those things wrong and said, forget this. I'm going to go find a loan. I'm going to go start my own printing press.
I'll go do it on my own.
And he ends up building one of the great printing companies of all time.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. In fact, the art of being an employer, a business owner with the staff that needs some help. I mean, if you're a sole proprietor, you're doing it all yourself, your main focus is on your work and keeping customers happy. But once you start to add in employees, the art of being a business owner and an employer is, first of all, talent scouting. You're always looking around for just who, within my budget that I have as a business owner, there's always limited resources, limited constraints, but whatever my budget is, whatever my resources are, where's the best talent? Who are the best people that I can find to come on board and agree to help? And then once I get them on board, a smart employer will always try to find out what the good, valuable employees, what do they value? What is it that they want and what do they need? And how can the employer help fulfill that, satisfy that to in the best way possible? So you're absolutely right. This is the way to think about a job in a free society. Everything we've just talked about here is the way free human beings interact with each other. They choose with whom to associate. In a way, the whole realm of a job or business is just an extension of our personal lives. The fact is, right, we have a right to our own freedom. We have a right to our own property. So when we think of things like friendship, with whom are we friends? And the answer is, well, the people we want to be friends with, right? We offer our friendship to people we like, and hopefully at least some of them accept the offer and they agree. But it's all voluntary. It's all mutual. Who comes into our houses? And the answer is the people we invite into our house. We get to decide who we want to invite and who we don't want to invite. And it doesn't really matter what the reason is. Maybe some people, choose to include or exclude people for some rather jerky reasons. Well, free people are free to be jerks, free to be rude. But the fact is that's our property, so we get to make those decisions. Now, it's fascinating. Once you take a piece of private property, a building, a facility of some kind, and you attach a label to it, you call it a business. Now, all of a sudden, progressivism comes along and says, hold on. You're not going to just run that the way that you want, the way you do with the other kinds of property. We in government, we're going to have all kinds of things to say about what you do with that business, including if you offer a job, all of a sudden now progressivism says we're going to define what that thing is, what that job is, including things like we're going to tell you how much you're going to pay your employees. We're gonna set a minimum wage, and if you're running a business that's really doing poorly, you're losing money, you're about to go bust and close the doors. Government says doesn't matter.
Right.
You shall pay this minimum wage, and if you're right, and many businesses go broke because of that, including all kinds of features about the job. To whom are you going to offer job? Progressive government says we want to be involved in it. We're going to tell you to whom you're going to offer jobs, to whom you're not going to offer jobs. Maybe you need to fire someone. Oh, progressive government has a whole lot to say about that. In 1964, Congress passed one of the most important. It's called a Civil Rights Act.
Right.
I'm reluctant to call it a Civil Rights Act because most of the 1964 Civil Rights Act most of it has nothing to do with civil rights. Civil rights are rights within civil society to participate in the civil governance of civil society. So think of things like the right to vote, right? You can't participate in shaping your government if you don't have the right to vote. The right to a trial by a jury of your peers when you're accused of breaking civic law, right? The laws that all citizens are supposed to obey. Those are civil rights. And much of what the 1964 Civil Rights Act talks about are things like jobs. A job isn't a civil right. A job, as we just talked about, a job should be a mutual voluntary agreement. A job is no more of a civil right than a friendship is, right? No one would say a friendship is you don't have a civil right to any friendship. You have a right to be free and try to earn friends, woo friends, attract friends, but you don't have a civil right to friendship or to friends in the same way you don't have a civil right to a job. But that's not the way progressive government looks at it.
And we have to remember how trusting you have to be of a government, right? I don't understand how so many people out there are so trusting of a government to say, okay, now we're going to make laws that say these civil rights benefit you. But before the 1964 Civil Rights Act, let's go back to Woodrow Wilson progressivism. Let's go back to the 30s when the government was saying blacks or other genders or other people, you can't work here. Right. We're going to pass laws that say you can't have these people. And there's this really interesting balance here of right now, everybody's from a political standpoint, it's politically expedient to talk about individual workers, and we're going to guarantee minimum wages, and we're going to guarantee certain working conditions, and we're going to guarantee certain jobs and all of these things to individual workers. But there's nothing out there that prevents the government from flipping that on its head if it became politically expedient to start saying, you know what? We don't care about the worker anymore. We care about the employer.
Right.
And we're going to give all of the benefits and all of the power to the employer. and the individual doesn't get any rights anymore.
Well, there's so much to unpack here. I want to respond to a couple of points that you raised. One is when we think about the progressive concept of a civil right to a job, what that really means in practice is government bureaucrats are now controlling business owners and employers. Mm-hmm. So if an employer, say, fires someone, terminates a job for the wrong reason, based on someone's gender or skin color or national origin. Those are actually terms used in the 1964 Civil Rights Act. Title VII of that law is all about what they call workplace discrimination. And what it really means is government bureaucrats controlling business owners and employers because of this idea of that some people have a civil right to a job. Well, what if instead progressive government said, we think business owners have a civil right to employees? Oh my goodness, wouldn't this change things? Now all of a sudden, government might come and say, you, as a citizen, you shall work at that company over there. And you would say, but I don't want to work at that company. I don't like what they do. I don't want anything to do with them. Doesn't matter. They have a civil right to employees, and they're short of employees.
You know what that sounds like to me?
Therefore, you're going to go work for them.
You know what that sounds like to me? Universal health care.
Very, very, very much, right?
You-
You're going to be a doctor. You're going to be a nurse.
You have the capability of being a great surgeon.
Yeah.
Therefore, you must be a great surgeon. And not only that, we're talking about minimum wage laws right now and all of that. What if there was a maximum wage law? What if because of universal health care, they said to a doctor, you have a really steady hand, you have a really good ability to perform surgery, and we're going to create a maximum wage of $50,000 a year for doctors.
Right. Well, and what you're describing is a real thing in many socialist nations.
Right. It's where it always ends up.
It's where it always ends up. So, you look at all the great grand experiments in central planning over the last century, the biggest being the Soviet Union, communist China, but also many smaller, petty communist and socialist regimes. These tyrants rise to power by promising free stuff. They say free education, free housing, free health care, free food. Just support me. Just help me get in power. And then once that demagogue who's been flattering people and promising things is actually in a position, this happens every time. This happened to Stalin. This happened to Mao. They start looking around. They think, oh, darn, I just promised all this stuff to all these people. How am I going to deliver it? I told them all they'd have free health care. How can I make this happen? And all of a sudden, the government has to start pointing guns at people and say, you shall go be a nurse, go be a doctor, go be a medical technician, because I promised all these people free health care.
And to all of those people out there who are listening to this, who might one day listen to this, who say, that could never happen in the United States, I point to one thing: education.
That's right.
We right now have maximum wage laws. We have set wages on education because the government has promised free education to everyone.
That's right.
And they have to provide it. And they have a set budget, and they still exceed that budget. The pension liabilities are way askew, and they're basically running these Ponzi schemes to keep these pension liabilities active. But they have promised free education, and now they have to go pay teachers.
That's right.
And that's why teachers are all complaining about being underpaid.
So I want to be real clear. You're saying if I become a teacher, K through 12.
You were a teacher.
I was a teacher. I was a professor at the college level. If I become a teacher within a K through 12 school system, and just to be clear, I have no credentials to do that. All I have is a PhD, which doesn't qualify
in the
me
social sciences.
which qualifies me to teach nothing, even at the kindergarten level. But if I were to go back and get my degree and my license in education and teach within a public school system, you're telling me that even if I'm really entrepreneurial, really creative, really productive, and I am far better than everyone else, you're telling me I cannot earn $400,000-$600,000 as a teacher?
Who's going to pay that? I mean, I would. If it was my children and I had the money and I could say, this is the best teacher I could possibly find.
Right.
I hate to make these conversations really personal and divulge a lot of personal information.
Don't give out your bank account number, Dave.
I won't do that. Maybe just the routing number.
Okay.
But my mother was a teacher for 40 years, most of her career in Denver public schools. She started in Queens, New York. My mother had people showing up. She won awards as Teacher of the Year. She had students excelling in her classes. Her standardized testing scores were higher than almost everybody in the state year after year after year. She had parents coming early to request to make sure their kids got in her class. And never once was there ever an opportunity for her to walk into her principal's office, walk into the Department of Education, whether on a local level or on a federal level, and say, I'm a better teacher than most. I provide more value to my students than most, and I want to be paid like it.
Imagine if she had said, I'm just going to make up some numbers here. I have 40% more demand. I have 40% more parents coming and wanting their kid in my class than my colleagues. Therefore, I should be paid 40% more. There's a kind of merit, right? That's a good merit-based argument. Doesn't fly in a public school system because they've said we're going to provide free education, which means we have limited resources. We have to put a salary cap,
right,
a limit on how much we can spend. It's absolutely right. Here's another way that we talked about progressive government, which again is all about central planning. This is the central idea of progressivism is central planning. Allegedly smart, intelligent, academic types sitting in bureaus, scratching their chins, and deciding how people are going to live their lives, what kind of houses they're going to live in, what kind of food they're going to eat, the medicine, health care that they have, all the education. And when we think of progressive government today helping certain groups of people, granting certain entitlements, certain perks, certain advantages to people with certain skin color, certain sex, things like this, the same progressive government that does that now used to do the opposite. The whole history of labor unions starting in this country, labor unions grew out of the progressive movement. Labor unions worked with progressive democratic, going all the way back to Woodrow Wilson through FDR. And one of their arguments was, they said, okay, building on that progressive science of race, we know that black people are inferior. They are a subordinate class of people, and they should not, therefore, have the kinds of jobs that white people have. And they were trying to figure out, how do we do this? How do we prevent black people from working in these jobs that the superior, allegedly superior white people really should have? And the labor unions were the answer. They said, here's what we'll do. We'll command a certain minimum wage because many business owners are only willing to hire black people if they can pay them a very small amount. They're not going to pay them a higher wage. And so by raising the minimum wage, it was a way to keep black people out of the workforce. Right. And there were many free blacks in the 1920s and 30s and 40s who said, look, I will happily work that job for a small wage because my alternative is nothing. I don't have another job. I would rather be earning a little than a lot. And so it just highlights that this desire, this core push within progressivism to plan, to design, to control. One of the words I want to bring to the attention of our listeners, and I'm going to mention this again. We'll repeat this. It's that word allow. When you really reflect on it, you can tell when you're talking to a progressive. And again, I want to make this clear that there are progressive Democrats, there are progressive Republicans, there's progressives of lots of different party affiliations. What they share in common is this notion that government should be planning, controlling. And so they will talk about what the government should or should not allow people to do. To tie this back within our discussion of a job as a voluntary agreement, and we agreed, we said, well, that means either party is free to end the agreement at any time for any reason, for no reason at all. It means a business owner could fire someone just because he's grouchy and in a bad mood that day. And he says, I'm firing all of you. Now, that's probably a pretty stupid thing to do. It won't be good for his business. He probably will have a hard time hiring people in the future, but he's free to do that. The progressive will say, you mean you think government should allow business owners to fire someone because of their skin color, hair color, eye color, sexual preference, whatever kind of special protected classes we have? And think of the premise there. When they say, should a business owner be allowed? A smart thinking listener, the very first question will be, well, who's doing the allowing? This is the United States. I didn't know that there was some panel of bureaucrats who sit and decide what property owners are allowed to do and not allowed to do.
You keep using the term government, but if we're really talking about progressives, it's not government, it's leaders. It's the leaders. It's who are the leaders allowing. It's funny, we've been having these conversations for the last few weeks, just as the 2020 presidential election is really kicking into full gear.
Yep.
And I keep seeing, you can't watch TV at this point without seeing a Joe Biden commercial and a Donald Trump commercial back to back in every commercial break of every TV show on television. We're already there. It's going to be a long couple of months.
Right.
But Joe Biden is running a commercial that is the epitome of this whole progressive jobs idea. He says, in 2016, we elected a president who has chosen to divide our country. We need a leader who is going to bring jobs back to people. Good union jobs, he says. He follows that. Jobs back to the people. Good union jobs. And it immediately goes there. And I'm sitting there thinking he is dreaming of the progressive paradise, so to speak.
Yeah, in fact, let me give a historical example here of exactly what Joe Biden is talking about. And this again this is part of the progressive transformation of what should be a simple concept of a job, which should just be an agreement. It should be like a friendship. It should be an agreement. And if anyone within a friendship wants to end the friendship at any time, they should be free to do it. That should be a job. Instead, Congress during the New Deal, when Franklin Roosevelt was president, Congress passed and the president signed a law called the National Labor Relations Act. And the one main thing that it did is it created the National Labor Relations Board, of course, which creates this organization staffed with bureaucrats who are now going to oversee and write regulations that will control how business owners interact with employees. Part of those regulations that came out actually criminalized, and now think of the 1930s and 40s. This is a high peak period of unionization. So suppose you own a factory, and you have an office up on the second level, and you can see down the factory floor, and some of your employees invite in some union representatives. And the union representatives well, you can see them. It's your property. It's your business. And there they are, those union reps walking around talking about unionizing your factory. And suppose you stopped what you were doing and you walked down the steps and you asked your employees, said, please shut down all the equipment just for a moment. I want to tell you guys something. And you said, I want to share with you the financial truth of this business right now. We've been losing money for the last 3 or 4 quarters. Things are going badly. We barely have our nose above water as a business right now. And if you unionize and you force a significantly higher wage, this place will shut down. You won't have a job. None of you will have jobs. I won't have a job because the whole thing's just going to shut down. We can't afford it. If you do that, you've just committed a federal crime. You've just violated federal regulations. They call that a hostile work environment under federal regulations, right? Do you see how the progressive notion of trying to control what a job is requires things like controlling speech? Now all of a sudden the federal bureaucrats are controlling what you may and may not say within your own property, within your factory that you built with your capital. Once we grant this notion that a job is a civil right, that someone has a rightful claim to it, what that really means is lots of people in government now have to control lots of aspects of business owners and property owners. If we fast forward to the 1960s, you see the whole regime of affirmative action takes off. And this is where government regulators in the National Labor Relations Board, as well as organizations like the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. The only thing I like about the EEOC is it gave Clarence Thomas a place to work for a while before becoming Supreme Court justice. But what they've done is they've gone so far as to say certain businesses, if you're above a certain minimum number of employees, we're going to come tell you how many women you must hire, how many people with black skin you must hire, brown skin, other kinds of protected classes. At the same time, if you fire someone and that person's in one of those protected classes, that person can go file a federal lawsuit. Imagine that. The Supreme Court just handed down an opinion a few weeks ago adding to this to the list of protected classes in the 1964 Civil Rights Act, Section 7. The idea of transsexuals, bisexuals, and someone, in other words, fired for their sexuality. So suppose you hire someone who is a man, when you think he's a man, he appears to be a man, and it's a position, for whatever reason, you want a man in that position.
Right.
And later, this person starts showing up with a long wig and makeup and a dress and now calls himself a woman's name and says, no, I'm really a woman. And you say, this isn't going to work. This isn't you're not the person I wanted for this position. And you let that person go. You want to hire somebody else. That person can go and file a federal lawsuit. And now you, the small business owner, you're going to go up against, well, the full force of the federal government. You're going to go up against the United States Civil Rights Commission. You're going to go up against the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. All the bureaucrats, all the lawyers, all the judges. And who wants to deal with that? And the answer is nobody. And it kind of raises this question in my mind. In a world of progressive central planning, how many bureaucrats should be paid and staffed to oversee each employer? Because any employer might make a hiring or firing decision that runs in the face of some of these progressive regulations. And so how many bureaucrats, think of those teams, those armies of bureaucrats that we're paying their salaries through our taxes just so that they can come and tell us how we have to run our own businesses and use our own property.
Which goes back to the problem that we've talked about repeatedly through all of these podcasts, which is they're not elected. We have no say in what are their priorities. Why is that person creating this? What is that person? What's important to that person? Why are they? Where is all of this coming from? And there's two things happening. One, we have a tendency to notice our bureaucrats focusing more on the Walmarts than the small businesses, right? They look at everything through the lens of these huge, massive employers who say, you're Walmart and you should be able to afford to pay a minimum wage of $15 to all of your employees, with no reflection that 80% of our economy is based on small businesses.
Right. There's also the little fact of how many of those bureaucrats have run a company like Walmart.
Well, that's true also. But the other problem is, I talk all the time. I've said this in a few of these conversations about the dominoes, right? They often look at, we want individuals to get paid more, so we're going to create a universal minimum wage, and we're going to raise that wage, and we're going to keep raising that wage, and we're going to keep raising that wage. But they don't look at what are the long-term effects. And I go back to the conversation we had a week ago, and then a conversation we had in the first week about my progressive friend or friend of a friend around the fire pit who was saying, I want better art and I want more support for the arts and people to be able to make a living doing that. And I think of a story, and I don't want to get too much in the weeds and in too much detail, but when you think about music is one of the arts. Music is one of these things. And all of these unions and all of these minimum wages have an enormous impact on making art harder to create. So you have all of these progressives out there who say, you business people, you don't celebrate art, you don't celebrate music, you just want people to go pound a hammer or do accounting or do whatever it is. But these unions create minimum wages that force wages to be so high that to actually record a music album goes through the roof.
That's right.
And there are all these stories about these off-the-grid music studios. There's one here in Colorado. There was one down in Alabama that have produced some of the greatest music of all time solely because they went into an unincorporated area that was not controlled by unions where they could control the entire environment. And when you get that small business owner who actually understands what needs to happen rather than what should universally happen because of unions, you get a better product.
I'm going to suggest that we save that this particular topic. There was a famous example right outside of Boulder, Colorado, and it's such a wonderful topic. I think we should set that aside for its own discussion. But you're absolutely right. It makes everything more expensive. It keeps people from getting jobs, from doing the kind of work that they want to do, from being productive, from being creative, even in artistic ways. It's more expensive today in the progressive, regulated, highly regulated United States. It's more expensive to be creative in any way than it was 50 years ago, 100 years ago. There's another aspect I mentioned before, the regime, I'm going to call it, the regime of affirmative action, these policies at the federal level as well as at the state level that said impose quotas on businesses, say you must hire people based on how they look. I used to teach at a little liberal arts college in Michigan called Hillsdale College. And it was sort of famous because it's become famous because they refused to comply with that whole affirmative action. They got sued by the federal government, by the Department of Education, which demanded that Hillsdale turn over. They wanted all the racial data of students and faculty, how many have white skin and how many have black skin and brown skin. And Hillsdale's response is, we don't have that data. We don't ask anybody. We don't have the little boxes for people. We just ask people, are you smart? Are you a good, ambitious student? Then we invite them to come study with us, and we don't ask them what color their skin is. And this led to a court decision that said if any federal money gets to the college through the way of the student, so think of government loans and grants and things like that, then the college would have to comply. And this is when Hillsdale decided to just reject all that federal funding, so they didn't have to comply. But many businesses do have to comply with these things. And, it's sort of fascinating, the backdrop, the backstory of behind affirmative action, race-based affirmative action. It's ultimately tied to the terrible, ugly story of slavery in the United States. And throughout the 19th century into the 20th century, there was one dominant, national, influential political party called the Democratic Party, which is still around today. That was the party of slavery prior to the Civil War. After the Civil War, it was the party of the rise of domestic terrorism, race-based terrorism, groups like the KKK. These were Democratic groups. Then the rise of Jim Crow, saying you passing laws saying if you're have black skin, you can't go into this hotel or that restaurant or whatever. And around in the 1960s, the Democratic Party starts to see that this subjugation of black Americans, it's coming to an end. There's too much public attention and public sympathy for the cause of equal civil rights for black citizens. And so Democrats are start scratching their chins saying, okay, We've gotten as much as we can by beating up black people, pushing them down, terrorizing them, enslaving them. We're going to have to shift gears. What can we do? And what black people during Jim Crow, what they were asking for was a simple thing. They said, look, we're being terrorized. We have the Klan showing up at midnight, committing acts of arson and vandalism and worse, assault and rape and murder. Get rid of that stuff. That's what black people were asking for. We just want to be protected in our persons and our property like other citizens. We want to enjoy the equal protection of the laws. Democrats said, no, we're not going to offer you that. Here's what we will offer you, is we'll offer you some perks, some subsidies, some special treatment. If you have black skin, you'll become a protected class, and we'll make sure that you can't be fired from a job, or you get additional ACT or SAT points when your kids are applying to college and things like this. So basically that party goes from hurting black people, threatening them, controlling them, to bribing them. And that's how we get this regime of affirmative action. It's a progressive innovation. It's another form of central planning. And it's so deep set into the minds of many Americans today that we have to have these affirmative action policies. We have to control who business owners hire and in what conditions they may or may not fire. And it's not true. Free people work these things out. If you think back to the 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s, that whole period of Jim Crow, imagine if black Americans, now many of them lived in poor neighborhoods and these things, if you just changed one variable, if they were actually secure in their property and in their person, like the law, the cops, the prosecutors, the judges, the courts actually protected them and would prosecute people who tried to hurt them.
Like the Constitution guarantees that.
Well, yeah, exactly, right? Equal protection of the law. Everything they would have been free. They would have had the incentive that others had to be creative, to be productive, to create value, to create wealth for themselves. We see, it's fascinating. One of my favorite stories that show It gives you a taste, a sample of how free people interact. And it's the story of baseball. It's the story of Jackie Robinson. Jackie Robinson he was hired by Branch Rickey.
Branch Rickey.
In 1947.
Right.
Tremendous. This year changes, so much with hiring Jackie Robinson. And I want to make it clear, the Dodgers did not hire Jackie Robinson because he had black skin.
Right.
They hired Jackie Robinson because he's really good. They wanted the best baseball player they could afford, and on their budget, it was Jackie Robinson. And he was really, really good. And he turned out to be a tremendous record-setting baseball player. This was in 1947. Now, baseball teams are businesses, and many of them were owned by racist, white supremacists who did not want to hire players with skin color. Those racists were hiring according to skin color, and it was whites only. They only wanted to hire whites. The Dodgers, and then eventually some other teams, they said, well, we don't care about skin color. We're just going to hire the best. And what quickly happens is the teams that would only hire based on race started losing more and more games to the teams who hire the best. They start winning World Series after World Series after World Series. And eventually throughout the league, every team, including teams who had some racist, white supremacist owners, eventually they said, you know what, I think we just got to start hiring the best players regardless of what they look like, whether they have white skin or black skin or any other color, if we're going to compete. And by 1959, this is 5 years before the Civil Rights Act of 64, by 1959, every professional baseball team was hiring players of all different colors based on their skill, based on their merit.
But something happened in between that. I think this can't go overlooked. In between 1947, when Jackie Robinson signed with the Dodgers, and 1959, when baseball was fully integrated, the owners of baseball teams went to Congress. They sought exemptions on monopolies so that they could create a situation where they had central planning, right? They sought central planning before they ended up fully integrating.
Right.
And they thought central planning is going to be our solution. And they did so. They get these...
Wait, Dave, you're not saying that progressives have actually used government power to influence sports. Are you saying that?
Never. Not in the pros, not in college, nothing else. No, in reality, they went to Congress and they said, we should have the right. You need to help us. You need to be these central planners. And they blocked things like free agency. So sure, every team can sign their black players, but we're going to sign them for less money. And we're going to create regulations and we're going to create restrictions that are passed down from government. And we ended up having to go to Supreme Court cases. We ended up having to go to the courts to allow certain players to be treated like human beings, to have the right to leave a team that they didn't want to play for as a free agent. Because even in 1959, when all the teams integrated, you were still owned by your team.
Right.
When you signed that contract with your team, that team owned you.
Well,
and if you didn't want to play there, you couldn't play anywhere.
But tell me, you could just go create another professional league, right?
Not at all.
You could do that.
Not at all, because the government, they said, you're going to centrally plan this for us. And the government created restrictions that said, you can't build another stadium. They prevented other teams from coming in and saying, you can't build a stadium within X number of miles of that stadium without our permission.
Which means they really prevented other leagues. I mean, what it means is they essentially created a monopoly,
right,
for Major League Baseball,
right,
and said this is going to be the only professional, baseball league in the United States. And let's make it real clear about this subject of monopoly. Every business that's a monopoly is connected to government. Monopolies are government-created monopolies because government is the ultimate monopoly.
Right.
It is the monopoly on legalized force.
Right.
No other institution, no other organization has an army and a police force and courts and jails and prisons and death execution chambers. No business does, no church does, no civic organization does. The Vino Veritas Society doesn't have any prisons or any death chambers. Who does those things? Government does, right? And it's legalized force. So it's the ultimate monopoly, which allows them to use that force to create monopolies for their friends, for certain businesses, for certain industries, and drive out competition. And what that does, it's yet another form of central planning, progressive central planning, trying to design an entire industry like professional baseball.
Which is in the claim of we're trying to keep competitive balance, right. The importance of this league. Why is it so important that the NFL or Major League Baseball survive? Why did government decide one day that these sports leagues must survive? We have to protect them. You and I, we start the Vino Veritas Society. We could go out of business tomorrow. Yep. There's nobody out there. There's nobody in government saying, you know what, the Vino Veritas Society is really important. So we're going to create all of these laws and all of these regulations. We're going to allow them to create salary caps, and we're going to enforce them. You can't hire anybody. You can pay a maximum salary.
Right.
Nobody can make more than that. And we're not going to create any other jobs like that. We're not going to allow any other jobs out there like that, so that that player, that person, if they want to go work for you, they have to work for that amount or they can't play at all. They can't participate at all. They can't work. And somebody out there decided that baseball and basketball and football, these professional sports leagues, have to be successful. So we're gonna create all of these rules and all of these regulations to limit competition from other leagues, to protect them from having to spend too much money.
Creating a monopoly.
And
think of how when you think of what that means for players on professional sports teams, and this trickles all the way down right to the college level and the high school level, who may get paid and who may not get paid. And we actually have federal laws and regulations controlling all these things. It kind of helps you see how far we have gone with progressivism, how far we have gone from the simple concept that a job is a mutual voluntary agreement. Today, under local, state, federal laws and regulations, most jobs are anything but a simple mutual voluntary agreement. They're these highly regulated, highly controlled decisions made by nameless, faceless bureaucrats that most of us don't even know.
Who are being influenced by other people for their own sake and not for the betterment of individual rights, natural rights, anything else.
That's right. I think this is a good note here to wrap up our podcast on this notion of using this one example of a job and how progressivism has transformed this simple concept of a job into this highly complex. There are scores of bureaucrats and lawyers whose entire career is enforcing labor law, labor regulations, all price controls, wage controls, all these things. It's very far from the idea of a free society, which is why a free society, the idea of freedom, is in desperate need of guardians in our modern progressive world, which is why we have our motto at the Vino Veritas Society, No Sumos Custodes. We are the guardians.
Till next week.
Till next week.